Chapter 23. Love. The instructor met Team Gold in the school hangar and paced back and forth, reading from his scroll exactly what was going to happen and what would be expected of them. Despite the time that had passed since they had last seen each other, they all understood there was a time and a place for sentiment. Gideon discovered the remains of their campsite, showing they were nomadic. Volunteers from Atlas and Beacon discovered the pattern in their attacks, leading us to conclude their next possible campsite location. You all know what you have to do. The seriousness fell from his voice after a pause. I've taught you all so many things that perhaps won't serve you as well as they used to. Keep learning, and I'll keep listening. With a brief smile, they all felt the closest thing to a father's approval that they had ever known. He left the hangar without another word and allowed them entrance to the Atlian airship. They took their seats and began to observe various features they didn't recall from previous flights. Things sure are changing quickly, aren't they? Daniel mused. I just hope we can keep up with it, Olivia countered. They all nodded to themselves and began to gather themselves privately to prepare for the fight they had ahead. Gideon moved to bring out a map. Here's where they think the mountain men are currently. Assuming deductions were accurate, there's going to be some walking ahead of us. The terrain's going to be... Havilai interrupted. Mountainous? She stated with no loss of irony on the statement. After a brief exchange of laughter, he continued. Yes, they're not very original. The problem is that the areas between the kingdoms give them lots of options to choose from. Leia's modification should prove useful for mobility, so she will take the vanguard position. Daniel and I will... It was Daniel's turn to interrupt. Play the roles of Brick and Berserker? Gideon had grown accustomed to this new nickname and laughed hardest at it. Yes, we're not going to risk a vanguard assault since we don't know their numbers. There's one rule we always need to remember. They all recited it together. Never make a frontal assault on a superior force in an entrenched position. Gideon continued. There's only 4 of us. This will play out in 4 stages. We all know our roles. Havilai, you take recon. Daniel, you'll take sabotage. I'll take assassination. And Olivia? She couldn't meet his eyes, so she nodded at the map. Recovery. I understand. Gideon turned to each and every one of his friends and let them feel his assurance in them as well as his necessary doubts. This is how it looks on paper, but we all know that things aren't going to go how we want them to. This is how we accomplish our mission. If you have the opportunity to fulfill any of our roles, you take it. Daniel began prepping his new hammer, and Havilai began making sure her cables weren't tangled. Olivia simply sat and stared down at the map. Playing over Gideon's words in her head, she was worried and knew she wasn't the only one. She instinctively wrapped her arms around Daniel's arm, and he had become used to the gesture. Gideon rested his head on the back of his seat and began cracking his knuckles to keep himself busy. Havilai trusted her equipment to do its job and began looking to her teammates, expecting the same. Her imagination played out how she would perform each role briefly and was content with the outline she'd laid out for herself. Daniel appreciated Olivia's company and felt the tension in her arms. He knew the closer they got to their destination, the more time that stress would have time to build. He let the last dust crystal fall into his weapon and set it aside. Are you doing okay? She looked up at him. Even with the presence of her infrared goggles, there was an unasked question displayed in them. He took a guess as to what it was and gave the best he had in return. We're all coming back. She blinked beneath the red glass. You promise? He took her hand in his. She stopped him and took off her glasses to meet his own. You promise? He nodded. Trying to lighten her mood, he matched her tone for emphasis. I promise. It didn't seem to settle her, but it was the best he could do. He didn't know why she seemed so anxious, and tried to remember the last time they had a talk of this nature. He was shocked to find years stood between that time and where they found themselves. A casual grim hunt had become a last stand when they found out just how much they were missing Gideon, practically as well as socially. Havilai didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of their situation. Either that or she just chose not to think of it in those terms. He admired her ability to make the worst of situations into the most trivial of inconveniences. It was when those inconveniences actually came that she flew off the handle. His eyes turned to Olivia, who clearly understood where she was and what was about to happen. She had been taking pot shots from the hip, still unfamiliar with her new weapon, and adjusting from an archer pose to a sniper stance. Glancing hits weren't slowing them, and by the time they came within reach of Daniel's, it created more problems than it solved. Havilah was in her own world, evading and ducking beneath their legs and forcing their blows to hit each other than their intended targets. It wasn't much, but it would buy them time. "Livy!" Her nickname hardly seemed appropriate, but her irritated glance at least got him her attention. "Can you hit me?" The lowering of her barrel said all it needed to. He simply repeated himself. "Can you hit me?" He carefully and slowly yelled each word as if it were his own statement. They didn't have time to pause, and the rising stress almost made her want to shoot him for asking such a question. He raised out his arms after breaking the jaw of a charging Beowulf and waited. She dropped her shoulders after a moment, showing she was letting out some form of frustration. She took aim and fired, hitting him directly in the face. The inertia and force of the blow should have at least made him stagger, but he simply took the dust and all the pain that caused with a smile. He let his arms drop, and a single tear could be seen falling from his left eye. "You know where it hurts. Exactly where it needs to. Now start shooting, you little dummy." She started crying behind her goggles. The small puddles moved aggressively below her field of vision every time she turned. She saw a Grim about to meet Leia as she jumped off the chest of one Grim, hoping the angle would push him into another. They had gotten wise to her technique and were preparing to kill each other if their collective goal was accomplished. She let out a sharp breath and reminded herself. "If you can hit your friend, then you better—" She let off a shot, and dust passed perfectly through both of the monster's eyes from its side. The sudden change disoriented and enraged the creature, causing it to miss her friend and hit the lesser Grim across where Leia once stood. Daniel raised his hammer for a moment in approval and threw himself back into the fray. His hammer arced upward, shattering a rock that the Alpha found purchase on. It fell blinded, with one of its legs left at an unnatural angle. Havilah vaulted onto the beast's chest and plunged both of her knives into its sternum. Losing the will to keep fighting, it returned to the dust, and the surrounding Beowulf were routed. Leia began running after them, throwing a slew of curses after them like it was a weapon all its own. Olivia continued to gun them down between their shoulder blades and necks until they had traveled almost 800 meters away. She continued to hit every target. She didn't break in focus and almost forgot the battle was over. Her dust canister emptied, and she frustratedly went to put in another. Before she had a chance to chamber a clip of the material, two massive arms picked her up off the ground and swung her in a circle. She wasn't in the frame of mind to understand what was happening, and lifted the stock of her rifle to hit whatever was grabbing her in the face. Before the blow connected, she saw it was her friend. After letting out a series of sharp breaths, they eventually melted into sobs and returned his embrace. Her back rose and fell sharply as the stress of near death passed, and he let her let it out. Havilah continued chasing after the Grim, and Daniel took the time to amuse himself with the sight. "Get back here, you mangy dingoes! You're better off picking a fight with hitchhiking children and bacon! I'll find a way to turn your dust into paint!" The distant, fruitless coaxing trailed off and left the two of them alone. One rested in the other's arms, waiting for both of the wounds they inflicted to save the other had healed. Daniel shook his head and realized he had almost fallen asleep. Fond memories were precious to him, and he found himself thankful for the life he had to relive. What brought all of their attention back to the moment was a red light appearing above the entrance to the cockpit. "It's time," Havilah pointed out and began making her way to the back of the ship. Daniel tapped Olivia on the shoulder and realized he had woken her up. A deep intake of air followed a flurry of activity that he had only seen before when she discovered she had overslept and was late for an exam. "Better mindset than before," he muttered to himself and gathered his gear. The ramp fell, exposing them to the passing rocks and trees. Havilah spared those behind her a glance before simply jumping and releasing her parachute. Gideon looked around and eventually found an ideal spot to land instead of trying to figure that out mid-flight. Daniel and Olivia did the same. With their full attention on the mission, it began.